The stone which you builders rejected has become the capstone. Acts 4:11.
Clearly, Chennault was born on September 6, 1893. He had earned his wings in 1919 before being honorably discharged in 1920. Enlisting again in 1923, he assumed command of the 19th Pursuit Squadron in Hawaii. Here, Chennault would begin to form radical ideas on pursuit aviation, publishing his ideas in 1935, The Role of Defensive Pursuit. But its ideas were shot down by a military command whose popularity lay in bombers and not in fighters. He would test his ideas in an Air Corps exhibition team known as the Three Men on a Flying Trapeze, who competed during the 1934 and 35 national air races. With increasing disagreements with his commanding officers and health concerns, Chennault retired on April 30, 1937 from the Army Air Corps as captain. A day after retirement, he moved to China to accept a 3-month contract to survey and inspect the Chinese Air Force. Unknown to him was the verge of another world war. In a world conflict, Chennault would test his theories about air combat. The actions of one fighter group would prove him right. A few weeks after arriving in China, on July 7, 1937, the consequences of the Marco Polo Bridge incident made an excuse for Japanese troops to occupy the city of Peking, marking the beginning of the Second Sino-Japanese War. Immediately offering his services to Generalissimo and Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Chennault became the advisor to the Chinese Air Force. China's air defense would become Chennault's ultimate responsibility. To coordinate the efforts of Chinese fighters, he established an early air warning system. Spotters scattered across China would report the movement of planes from the ground, then feeding this information into a central comms room to track their movement. Fighters would then climb to altitude to meet these threats. China relied on imported foreign aircraft from the Civil War. Aircraft like the I-16 Ishak and Tupolev SB were gifted from the Soviet Union, but the Chinese pilots to fly these were mostly inexperienced and unprepared, routinely crashing on takeoff or in flight. On Saturday, August 14th, Chinese bombers even managed to accidentally bomb Shanghai, a city under Chinese control, scarring this date as Black Saturday. At Japan's use were the most disciplined pilots and modern aircraft. In 1939, Chennault reported on the nimble Nakajima Ki-27 Nate. It excelled in maneuverability and flight performance, but it sacrificed armor in exchange. It was far superior to the fighters that the Chinese used. Reporting again in the autumn of 1940, it was another fighter, the Mitsubishi A6M2-0. Beginning its combat test over Chungking, it quickly swatted any fighters out of the sky. Both fighters were overwhelmingly formidable opponents for the Chinese. Chennault reported both aircraft to the United States, but both were denied as aerodynamically impossible to be developed by Japan. With air superiority, Japan pushed further into the country. Japan's imperial grip rapidly stretched along the coastlines of China, straining the country of supplies from its harbors, starving the country. Supplies coming into China had to be brought through a route known as the Burma Road, the only lifeline keeping China in the war. Following a terror policy, kill all, loot all, burn all, the Japanese Air Force proceeded to terror bomb civilian cities, killing civilians and decimating morale. Nearly 10 million Chinese people would die from democide. The crippled Chinese Air Force could not stop the onslaught of bombers attacking their cities. Desperate for help, Chennault looked to the United States. Looking through newsreels, the American people had their sympathies to the Chinese people. Agreeing secretly to help China, on April 1941, President Roosevelt signed an unofficial executive order approving the formation of an American volunteer group under a 1-year contract. Recruiting was carried under a civilian company, the Central Aircraft Manufacturing Company, to circumvent laws about mercenaries. Enlisting from branches of the military, bribery was used to persuade many of them to retire from service to volunteer. For pilots, pay grades were higher than a general, at $600 per month with a $500 bonus for each Japanese plane shot down. In total, 99 pilots and 186 ground crew volunteered from various backgrounds. To make the trip, all volunteers claimed false identities and passports. They departed together from San Francisco aboard Dutch passenger ships to China. Arriving in Burma, pilots of the AVG began training in the summer of 1941. Each day, the pilots would meet with Chennault in a small room. Using his knowledge of Japanese aircraft, he parted away from traditional Air Corps training.
Tough-looking man, and rough skin and a raspy voice, and a really good leader. We had utmost respect for.
Pilots worked together in a pair system, providing mutual cover. With this, he trained his men not to dogfight at all, warned to avoid turn fighting at all costs. Instead, they used new aggressive fighter tactics. The Royal Air Force gave 100 P-40B Warhawks to the AVG, who promised to lend later variants of the P-40. It was far better than its Japanese contemporaries in speed, armor, and armament. Exploiting these advantages, Chennault trained his men to use high-speed diving passes, then using their speed to climb away, to be out of reach from their Japanese opponents. By the fall of 41, one squadron would paint the famed shark mouth design across their fighters from photographs in an Indian magazine. Chennault, upon inspecting the paint scheme, ordered all the squadrons to adopt the gaping shark mouth, unifying the squadrons under one design.
December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy.
In the Second World War, the AVG was prepared for combat. One squadron was sent to Rangoon, the rest to Kunming. Seeing first combat on December 20th, several bombers were intercepted and shot down heading for Kunming, with the rest dropping their bombs and fleeing home. With their first lopsided victory, the Chinese press were quick to lend a name to these heroes, the Flying Tigers. The Walt Disney Corporation soon caught on with the name, lending the iconic logo, a tiger flying out the V for victory. But the skies of Rangoon would seal the Flying Tigers' name in legend. In cooperation with the British Royal Air Force, outnumbered 5-1, they would earn the RAF's respect. From Christmas Day into spring of the New Year, the sky would become a fireball amidst the combat. Using diving attacks, they engaged up to more than 40 aircraft at a time, comprised of Ki-21 Sallies escorted by Ki-27 Nates. Each engagement will be lopsided victories for the Tigers, even with some losses. 2 pilots and nearly 13 aircraft were lost over Burma. By January 1942, the Tigers began taking the offensive to the Japanese, raiding Japanese airfields and logistics throughout Southeast Asia. With a burning desire to exterminate the fighter group, Japanese bombers attempted raids on the Flying Tigers airfields, even bombing during the cover of night. But Chennault's early air warning system denied them this privilege. Sometimes fighter sweeps were put out to clear the skies. In these efforts were new aircraft like the G4M Betty and Ki-43 Oscar, but both planes were inferior to the new late model P-40s like the P-48 Kitty Hawk that now equipped the Flying Tigers. Applying the same tactics as before, they prevailed over the Japanese. But even with a long streak of victories, the AVG had to face setbacks. In early 1942, the campaign over Burma was a loss, with not an overwhelming Japanese presence in the air, but on the ground. The loss of the Burma Road created supply complications. Supplies now had to be flown into China over the hump, in air passage through the Himalayas, the last vital supply line to keep China in the war. Plagued by supply issues, the pilots struggled to keep their P-40s in the fight. Mechanics even resorted to using duct tape and bubblegum to keep them airworthy. With the loss of airworthy aircraft, decoy aircraft were used to fool Japanese spotter planes. Making do with salvaged parts and ingenuity, mechanics worked miracles to repair the damaged P-40s. Without the ground crew, the AVG couldn't have pressed on. Though they contributed heavily in the war effort against Japan, the American Volunteer Group would disband on July 4, 1942. Chennault would stay in China and reinstate in the U.S. Army Air Corps as Brigadier General to lead the China Air Task Force, then the 14th Air Force. Under the same leader, the iconic shark's mouth would be embodied on the aircraft of their replacements. In the time of 7 months, they were credited with downing 299 enemy aircraft with 153 probables, for a loss of almost 73 P-40s, with 13 pilots lost in combat-related incidents, 10 in accidents, and 3 taken as prisoners. But with these losses, almost 20 pilots in the Flying Tigers would make A status. Following their successors, the 23rd Fighter Squadron would shoot down nearly 1,000 enemy aircraft under the Flying Tiger name. Chennault was promoted to Lieutenant General on July 1958, before passing away on the 27th. Leading his men through intelligence, teamwork, and tactics, his legacy was imprinted in his Flying Tigers that used doctrines of modern air combat against a military command that denied them. Commemorated for fighting against tyranny, ceremonies and citations of honor across the United States would uphold the squadron's name highly. Even recently, the Republic of China began to recognize the contribution of these volunteers. Some of the pilots who are still alive remember Claire Chennault.
We called him the old man, not to his face, but not out of any kind of disrespect, actually kind of out of reverence, because to us he was an old man at the time.
P-40s, with the grin of a shark, would become synonymous with the name of the Flying Tigers.